Good morning. Welcome to the Center for Journalism Ethics 2021 Conference on Local News Now and Ethics. This was supposed to be our 2020 conference. I recall this time last year being really crushed that the pandemic forced the cancellation of all of our events here in the center. But shockingly, the year has gone really quickly. And while we're still not able to gather in person, I am so happy and grateful to have this opportunity to be with you virtually. Again, I'm Katie Culver. I'm Director of the Center for Journalism Ethics and the James E. Burgess Chair in Journalism Ethics here in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's quite a mouthful. I am so grateful to everyone who has helped make this conference possible, including the sponsors that you just saw. The premier sponsor, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, has really helped us expand our reach and bring more people into this virtual conference than we would have been able to do in person. We're looking forward to the opportunities that all the challenges of the last year have presented to us, and keeping a virtual component to these conferences going forward. I'd also like to thank our administrator in the Center for Journalism Ethics, Krista Eastman. Krista has been absolutely unflagging throughout this pandemic year and has had such marvelous ideas for making this conference valuable for all of you who are able to join us. I'd also like to thank our advisory board here in the center. They are a non-stop, free-flowing well of ideas and contacts and inspiration, and we just don't know where we would be without them. So without further ado, I would like to kick off this year's conference with our keynote speaker, Byron Pitts. Byron, as you all know, is co-host of ABC News' Nightline, and he's covered national news for the network across all of their programming, including Good Morning America, World News Tonight with Dave Muir, this week, and 2020. Byron has multiple awards, including multiple Emmys, and is known, I think, most clearly for the depth of his storytelling. He's a tremendously talented interviewer and a deeply committed a journalist deeply committed to ethics. We couldn't imagine a better person for us to have. He's working on a national level, but he began locally in Greenville, North Carolina, and is such a strong supporter of local news and the ethical practice of local news. This is a challenging time in the local news environment. Every one of us recognizes that. And we know how important that local level journalism is to democracy. So I'm delighted to welcome Byron as our keynote speaker, and I will turn it over to him.
Good morning, my friend. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you all today. For the sake of full disclosure, in this universe we're living now, in this COVID world, I'm actually in a corner of LaGuardia Airport in New York. I arrived at the airport about 2 hours earlier than I needed to, so I could be in position to spend time with you. It is a life of a journalist. One of my dear colleague and mentor, the great Dan Rather, often says, fish gotta swim, birds gotta fly, reporters gotta go. And so I've got to go on the road today. So I apologize for the modest surroundings. I'm actually in a corner near a restaurant, by the service entrance, near a trash can, but it's relatively quiet and hopefully relatively peaceful, that we won't be too disruptive. I think the format is I'm going to talk for a bit, and then hopefully there may be an opportunity for questions on the back end. I hope I'm not making that up. I'm grateful for this opportunity, this conversation that we're able to have. And one of the things I've learned as a journalist, that the difficulties that COVID-19 has created for all of us, both professionally and personally, I think has also created opportunities. I found, as someone who does a lot of interviews in the past year, like all of us on Zoom and different platforms, there's actually a different kind of intimacy that one can gain in these kinds of conversations. That we are often in environments that are at least comfortable to us, familiar to us. And these conversations often feel more one-on-one than in a mass space, in an arena, or sometimes with an interview with lights and cameras and strangers in someone's private space. So I've leaned into that, and so hopefully you can lean into some of that today. And in general, this time that we live in, the opportunities that exist for us. I'm always grateful for opportunities to talk about ethics, because I think the reality oftentimes day to day for professional journalists who are focused with deadlines and scripts and editing and logistics, that sometimes, unfortunately, the whole discussion of ethics can get lost in the daily grind of for trying to produce work, to meet deadlines, to meet production schedules. So I'm grateful that we're going to take a few minutes to discuss ethics, and I'll certainly give you my perspective on it. For me, at the end of the day, ethics comes down to a very simple concept that as a person of faith, I believe is consistent with my faith life, which I believe is consistent with our profession. Do the right thing. Do the right thing. When I think about ethics, I think about the notion of facts versus truth. That I think so often in our business that we can hide behind facts. I think that leads us down the road too often to do things that may be factually true, but lack the sensitivity that decent people come to expect from people they interact with. And it is an interaction when people allow us into their homes through their TV sets or their phones or their devices. We become a part of their family. So there is a shared measure of decency that good and decent people are engaged in every day. And sometimes I think we get lost in, well, it's true. These facts are accurate. But sometimes I think when we discuss ethics, that facts aren't enough. As I see it, I use the analogy that the facts are that slavery was the law in the United States for a very long time. The truth is, it was always wrong. And I think as journalists, when we look at our ethics, that certainly it is based on the facts. But in the midst of those facts, we as journalists, I think, have the added responsibility to find truth in those facts. Not opinion, not to take a side, but to seek truth. Because I do believe once you can present facts, good and decent people can agree on the truth. I think that's potentially one of the telling moments of what we all witnessed this past week in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This trial that I know consumed a lot of us in the business, and a lot of people at home in different professions, corporations dealing with it, places of worship dealing with it, people in their homes at their kitchen tables dealing with what we all saw in those 9+ minutes of a man none of us knew, George Floyd, and a police officer none of us knew, Derek Chauvin, and what occurred. And to me, what one of the important things that occurred, because so often in our nation's history, in important moments, the reality has been, the facts have been, that Black America and white America see the same thing, but draw very different conclusions. But what we saw in this case with the verdict and a diverse American jury, 6 whites, 4 blacks, 2 people identified themselves as multiracial, saw the same information, had access to the same facts, the same video, and they drew the same conclusion in a relatively short period of time, about 10 hours. I think that's remarkable and that's historic, and it reminds us what's possible when good and decent people are presented the facts. They are given a roadmap to the truth, and they can come to a fair and reasonable decision. As was mentioned in the introduction, I've been a professional journalist for 40 years, which simply means I'm old. I had the good fortune to work in local television for 15 years before I made it to the network level. And I'm so grateful for that experience. As someone who grew up in Baltimore, my hometown, I've often said I had the best of both worlds. Raised Baptist, educated Catholic. And I believe as a journalist, I've been fortunate to have the best of both worlds. A 15-year career in local television at some dynamic TV stations and some wonderful communities. And now nearly 25 years at the network level. In local television, I started off in Greenville, North Carolina. Then I went on to Norfolk, Virginia. From Norfolk, I went to Orlando, Florida, then to Tampa, then to Boston, then to Atlanta, and then I made it to CBS News in their DC bureau and worked at CBS for 15 years. And I've been the last almost 10 years now at ABC News. So I think I've got to see a good portion of the country, at the very least, the East Coast. But my job is giving me the opportunity to visit a number of states, spend time in Wisconsin. And so I feel like I have a sense of our nation, and that was formed in great part by my experience in local television. For all of my colleagues who work in local, God bless you. I know some of the challenges that you face. You know, at the network level, sometimes I have one deadline a day, sometimes three on a crazy day. But for those of us who work or have worked in local television, you know that you could have 5 deadlines. The morning show a couple of times, the noon show, the 5 o'clock show, the 6 o'clock show, and if it's a really big day, the 11 o'clock show. And so that can be a long and demanding day. Also, one of the challenges, I think, when you work in local television is that at the network level, I can fly in. Like today, I'm going to get on the plane, fly someplace, do what I need to do. I'll get back on the plane. I'll come back to my home, which is New York City. But when you work in local television, the people that you cover, the people whose lives you explore, could be your neighbor, someone you're going to run into at the gas station, at the mall. And so it's a different dynamic. There's a different expectation placed upon you, an expectation that the viewers have of you. And certainly, I think ethics are vital to that. I don't think it's not our job as journalists to take sides, but it is to present the truth and to be mindful that there are multiple sides. I often hear people say there are 2 sides to the truth. That's not been my life experience. There can be multiple sides to the truth. It's almost, as someone described to me once, it's like a house. The front of the house might be brick, the back of the house might be vinyl, the side of the house might be something else, and the other side of the house might be all glass. And so depending on which side of the house you're on, that's what you see, but it's not the entire house. And so one of the challenges for all of us as journalists, whether our deadline is 10 minutes or 10 hours or 10 weeks, is to go to the house, do our very best to walk around the house, to see as many sides of the house as we possibly can, and then present the facts, and then present the truth about that house in that moment. As I mentioned, I've been at the network level for about 25 years now. You lose count after a certain point in your career, for those of us of a certain age. But I've been so very fortunate in my lifetime as a journalist. I've interviewed the last 7 presidents of the United States. I've covered 3 wars. I've been to 59 countries. And at last count, I've watched 49 people die. I've watched as American service members give their full measure to our great nation in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. For any and all the veterans on this call, thank you for your service. Welcome home. We all owe a debt to you we cannot live long enough to repay. So thank you for your service. I've in Haiti after the earthquake, the tsunami in Indonesia. I witnessed 2 executions. I was a witness to a man put to death in the electric chair in Virginia in like 1986. And I was a witness to the execution of Timothy James McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, a homegrown terrorist raised in a Christian household, convicted of killing 186 men, women, and children. So in many ways, as a professional journalist, I have made my living covering death. And I've made my peace with that. But something that makes me uncomfortable still is indifference. When good and decent people who are blessed with resource and opportunity are indifferent to what's going on around them. It pains me when I think about my colleagues. Really? Sorry, I'm being told to move. May I sit here for the 20 more minutes of giving a presentation? Is that okay? I'm asking for grace. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much. Okay. I think either she's showing me grace or she just decided to ignore me because I'm loud and I must seem. Thank you, ma'am. Where were we? Challenged by when people are indifferent to their opportunity to change the world. And I think we as journalists, we have that opportunity to change the world, to impact it with the tools, the weapons at our disposal, which is very simple. Facts, truth, detail. I know so often when I run into younger journalists, especially when they think about great storytelling, they think it's flowery language. They think it's really neat production and flashy pictures. And certainly pictures for those of us in television and the visual medium are important. But at the end of the day, from my perspective, the sexiest thing, the most appealing thing in a story of any story are the facts and the details. And the integrity that comes with good journalism. So I think in newsrooms, folks from different newsrooms who are participating on this call, I would encourage you to continue to lean into the facts, to lean into the truth, to shy away from opinion. I was in watching, being part of the news coverage earlier this week when the verdict came in. I saw a number of people become emotional on the air, and I'm respectful of that. And certainly those of us who are journalists who were human beings long before we were journalists and God willing, long thereafter. And in the midst of while we're being journalists, we're human beings. So I'm respectful of that. But I always encourage my colleagues, and I encourage myself, I remind myself that in these moments of national turmoil to do the best we can, to steel ourselves, to remain observers and not participants in the events that we cover. Now, I'm mindful that it happens. I got an email the other day, a viewer complaining about that very topic and some of the things that they saw in the air. And their suggestion was, their perspective was, it happened because this story relating to race involved the death of a black man. And when this particular person saw black people, journalists on the air, emoting, reacting in an emotional way, they were critical, they were judgmental. And I thank this viewer for their email and their thoughts. But I did want to make the observation that I didn't think what they saw was unique to black people, was unique to women. I pointed out that the great Walter Cronkite choked up when he announced to the nation that President Kennedy was dead. An equally talented and respected Peter Jennings became emotional on the air on September 11, 2001, when he announced to the nation on the air that he was relieved, not as a journalist, but as a father, that he was finally able to contact his children on what was a difficult day. So those two moments and others, I think, are reminders to us all that showing emotion in that way is not unique to a particular race or people, but it's human. And so we have those human moments. Yet and still, though, I think it's always valuable, I believe, that as best we can, that we steel ourselves in those difficult moments. Because as journalists, our job, our lane, is there primarily as storytellers, as witnesses to the truth. But it's a delicate balance. And I'm respectful of all those. I mean, I've had moments in my professional life, I think, where I've gotten close to the edge of that. And I throw no shade at those who do. But it's just, I think it's always a reminder to have the conversation about living in this space that we as journalists should attempt to live in most often. Also, when I think about ethics and what that means, not just for the individual journalists, but what it means for the particular newsroom, the organization. As I see, when I think about ethics, part of ethics, as I see it, is who's represented when we're making the decisions that we make. Whose perspective are we considering most? I gave the example. I had the great fortune this week to talk to a number of journalism students from the University of Wisconsin, and to those students who may be on this call, to the faculty and administration at the great University of Wisconsin, and to those of you who live in that community and elsewhere, know that their journalism school is rock solid. That the young people there are getting a quality education. And I'm so excited to know that the next generation of journalists will include young people from the University of Wisconsin who I know will do a great job because they're well prepared. They are being trained by gifted journalists, gifted educators. So I was comforted in those conversations with those young people. But I made the point in talking about the importance of inclusion. It's like, imagine if the student newspaper at the University of Wisconsin, this great campus, beautiful school, and a wonderful community, imagine if that student newspaper was produced at the University of Minnesota every day. What? Not only would that not be acceptable, I would imagine most people would quickly recognize that as talented as the kids may be at the University of Minnesota, they don't live in Madison. They don't get the red and white of the University of Wisconsin. And so even if they're good and decent people, they may not be able to tell the full story, the truth about what's going on at the University of Wisconsin. I think the same is true in newsrooms that do not reflect the communities that they're in. From my perspective, the issue of inclusion, as significant as the issue of ethics in my mind, that it isn't a matter of political correctness. It isn't a matter of doing a nice thing. I think it's doing the right thing. I think it's being true to what it means to be a journalist and to provide news. The part of our job, it's been said, the job of a journalist is to inform, enlighten, inspire, to shed light in dark places, to speak truth to power, to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, to give voice to the voiceless. I think you can do that best when your organization is reflective of the community that you cover. And from my perspective, that doesn't just mean black and white, but it means every community represented on your staff, in your organization, every faith tradition represented. Because how can you understand something if it's always foreign to you, if you don't have anyone who can relay, who can give it context, give it a perspective? I'll give you an example. Years ago, when I worked in local television, I was covering the presidential run of Jesse Jackson when he ran for president in the mid to early 80s. And we were at a black church somewhere in Virginia, I think. And Reverend Jackson is giving a speech, a politician speech, that quickly transitioned into a preacher sermon. With some Pentecostal flavor, so if you understand that. And at one point, he is hooting, as they say in the church, and some parishioners in the crowd are so moved, in the audience and the congregation are so moved, they stand up and they start running down the aisles, speaking in tongues. And I remember a couple of Secret Service agents who by this time were assigned to Reverend Jackson leaped forward, perceiving a threat. And I remember some of their Secret Service colleagues, men of color, held them back. I remember being in the back in the press pen, and some of my colleagues who thought they were seeing something potentially dangerous reacted. And I, in my own way, kind of said, it's okay. It's okay. Reverend Jackson is not in danger in this moment. Folk are feeling the Spirit of the Lord. And I was able to bring that context, that perspective, because not simply because I'm black, but as a person of faith who was raised in that church tradition, I recognize it, not as a threat, but as a powerful, joyous moment for the people who were experiencing it at that time. And so that's, I think, is the beauty of inclusion, having a variety of voices in your newsroom who can help you look at the house, all of the house, and see all that it represents. You know, as a person of color raised in Baltimore, Maryland, where I'm from, I'm clear about the difference between the police and the police, the police and the police. Well, people born and raised in certain communities recognize that. And so they're able to bring that context and perspective to experiences. But also regional diversity. I always caution my colleagues at the network level. As you know, the three major networks are all headquartered in New York. But we fail as an organization if our staff is representative of people who went to school in the Northeast, who were born and raised in the Northeast, then we won't fully get the timber that exists in good people in wonderful states like Wisconsin. We won't fully appreciate what different parts of the country represent how people see the world. It's great that we have people who went to college, but there's value in having people in the organization who are not college educated, because the vast majority of Americans are not college educated. So I think, as I think about ethics, I think about part of that, one of the fibers of that, and how a news organization determines what its ethics are. I think that determination is helped when the newsroom is diverse, when people see themselves in that space. I am respectful of everyone's time. I'm still getting the stink eye from the people here at the airport about where I'm set up. So I'm always grateful for this time. If there's an opportunity for questions, I'm happy for it.
Yeah.
So I'll turn it back over to my friend. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Byron. I wish we could be together for hours, but I'm mindful of the airport folks as well. We have some questions from the audience, but I'm going to steal the privilege to ask one first myself. And that is, you are widely respected in the industry for your sense of empathy. My dear friend, our mutual friend, Jill Geisler, mentioned that in the chat.
She's the best.
Yes,
Love Jill.
Jill is the best, and I'm so grateful for her service on our board. How, you have, as you mentioned, you have seen a lot. You have seen a lot of death and destruction. What do we need to do today to address the effects of those kinds of traumas on journalists themselves? You see the worst, and you tell us those stories. That has to have effects. What do we need to do to address that?
Oh, that's a great question. I think one of the things I'm grateful for at ABC News is that within hours of any crisis in the world, or certainly any crisis in the ABC News family, that they immediately make mental health experts available to staff. Because you're right, because we do experience trauma, from a car accident to the worst of war. And I think newsrooms do need to be sensitive to that, to provide resources to their people. I know what often happens in newsrooms, places that I've been, is that we find a group of people who seem particularly proficient at that kind of work, and therefore they're sent into those environments over and over and over again. I think there should be some recognition that they might need some healing, a place to talk. Also, I found in newsrooms that I've worked in, like, for instance, simple things like at Nightline, where I work, a very diverse and inclusive team. We have a meditation room on our floor. The decision was made to take a fairly large closet, put some comfortable cushions, pillows, seats. And so in those moments where someone might need to step away from the deadline, step away from the grind, to be able to go in there and to meet their mind, meet their God as they see fit, to have that moment, to be a human being. So certainly I think being sensitive to the mental health things. I know most news organizations responded in an aggressive way in COVID to make sure that people were tested, to make sure that they had the latest information in that regard. Bravo. To your point, I think that same level of support and urgency should be provided when it comes to mental health of people in newsrooms.
Fantastic. Let me turn to some of our audience questions. My colleague, Sue Robinson, says she'd love to hear you talk about the debate over the ethics of objectivity that are going on right now, especially around police killings of Black and brown people. Do you see multiple sides to this? Is objectivity still needed in these kinds of stories?
Oh, without question. I often have this conversation with younger journalists, or certainly students, in this notion where in this world in which people believe part of their job is efficacy on the behalf of groups, and I'm respectful of that. But at the end of the day, if you're going to call yourself a journalist, then our job is to live in the space of facts and objectivity. That I think all of us should bring our life experiences to the job. You can't leave it at the door. You can't leave it, back at home. But our job is to be objective. Is to not weigh in a personal way. One of the things that troubles me when I watch some of my brethren and sisters in some of the cable places in particular, without naming any names, where they spend a lot of energy talking about what they think, what their opinions are. And while I'm respectful of them and their journeys, that's not why I'm watching. And that's not our job. Like, one of the things I love about, if I can brag for a second about my great colleague, Diane Sawyer. I would imagine most Americans don't know what her politics are, don't know what her faith tradition is, don't know probably where she really stands personally on a variety of issues. But I think most Americans trust Diane Sawyer. They know that when Diane Sawyer shows up, that the people she deals with will be respected, and that she will make a real effort to get to the truth, to be objective. And so that, to me, that's our lane, that's our responsibility. That, certainly I tell people all the time, look, I've been a journalist for 40 years. I've been Black for 60. So certainly I think I know a lot about what it means to be a Black man in America. But when I'm called to do my job, I'm there primarily as a journalist. I'm many things. I'm a Christian. I'm a person of deep faith. I was like, I think there's a great Yogi Berra who once said, always dance with the one that brung you. I'm faithful. I'm respectful of all faiths. But I was raised as a Christian man. It's the religion that I know best. It is who I carry with me. Like, I wear, I don't mind showing you, I wear my late mother's cross, right? I take this every place. When I've gone to Muslim countries to report, it's covered. It's close to my heart. And I've never, not once a day in my professional life, denied who I am, what my faith is. And that's okay, because all of us bring our life experiences to moments. But when we arrive at the party, right? Some people can bring I'm showing my age now. Some people can bring the 45 to the 45s to the party. Somebody can bring the lemonade to the party. Someone brings some chips. Okay, when we show up at the party, our responsibility is to bring facts, truth, and to leave opinions back in the car, back at our place. So yeah, it's that always troubles me when people weigh in that way, and I think we do it oftentimes not intentionally, but it happens. Like when I hear this language about the brutal killing of George Floyd. Okay, first of all, when is killing not violent and brutal to begin with? So you're being redundant. But why add that? Why add that word? So it's, and I think that's one of the ways in which we lose credibility in our communities. That certainly when we are sharing, if we're sharing our own opinion, which might be the popular opinion at that moment, we are in that very moment distancing ourselves from other people who don't share that opinion. And so at some point down the road, and I think we see that part of what we see in part of the success of President Trump and rallying his base and making the argument that somehow journalists were the enemy of the state. Much of it was fraudulent, a lie. It was awful. It was terrible. It was gutter politics, but a lot of it, I think, was self-inflicted, because too often we easily decide that we're going to share our opinion, and that's not our job. Objectivity, that's our mission every single day that we work. If you want to have an opinion, then get an Instagram account and go do you, boo. But if you're going to be a journalist, stick to the facts. I'm not interested in your opinion, nor should the viewers or readers be.
I have another question from Joan, who asks, I believe the pandemic has negatively affected our mental health. I also believe our collective lack of mental health was not fully addressed by news media before the pandemic. What do you think about that?
That's absolutely right. I think, while I love our profession, I think we're vital to our democracy. We fail often. And you're right. I think that's one of many areas that we didn't address well. And I think there are some practical reasons as to why that occurs. I think fundamental to it is sort of I would argue, intellectual laziness, right? To do those kinds of stories, one, I will tell you as a broadcast journalist, that's not often visually compelling, right? Those are difficult stories to do. Then I know when you're talking about getting access to the professionals that you need, if you're attempting to tell, right, we're in the business, we're storytellers. We seek to share information through a particular narrative. It can be challenging to tell a narrative story when it comes to mental health, because you have to get people to trust you. It can be a longer journey, and sometimes in some newsrooms in smaller markets, you don't have the resources or the time. Right? It takes everyone's energy every single day to do weather, traffic, and a couple other spot news things, and that's it. And people are exhausted. They go home spent. And so that's real. But I think in newsrooms that have the capacity, that it's an opportunity that's been missed that needs to be explored. You know, another one of the many criticisms, I think legitimate ones of our business, is that, like, what exactly is news? How do we define what is news? You know, is it always negative? Is it always reacting to something? I know I think about this as a person of faith. There's so often, and many of us grew up, live in some faith tradition today, but yet so often faith is only discussed in the mainstream news media when there's some sort of scandal, sex scandal, financial scandal. But day to day, that's not the realities of most of us. You know, mental health. All of us, either in our own life, have had mental health or having mental health challenges. Certainly someone in our family, someone close to us. But it's a topic that we ignore. Right? I mean, the reality is most of us have more experiences with mental health challenges than we do with serial killers or 40-car pileups, but yet that's where we spend more of our time. And I would argue, in part because it's simple, in part because it's lazy, it's easier to go there and do that than to do the complicated stuff. And so I think I'm an optimist, and so I'm hoping that as newsrooms reevaluate how they will live moving forward as we move out of the pandemic, I would think, I know, for instance, at Nightline, we've done some very serious stories about mental health. We've done some very serious stories about the pandemic, which normally we might shy away from because of the complications of doing those kinds of stories. Well, we've done those stories. I think we've done them well, and we've been rewarded by viewership. And so I think I think if you do it right, if you do it well, I think news organizations will find, because at the end of the day, we are businesses, and part of the challenge day to day is you need people to watch and to read. And so often I think we cheapen what we do by thinking, let's go for the easiest, simplest thing to draw in viewers. Where I think we've learned during the time of this pandemic, you can tackle serious topics like mental health, and then if you do it well, people will lean in, and the organization will be rewarded for it.
We are getting so many wonderful questions in the chat, but I apologize for timing purposes and airport security purposes. This is going to be our last question, our wrap-up question, and it comes from Jill. Byron, decades ago, you volunteered to do a content analysis of the diversity in your local newsroom's coverage. Share that story and connect it to work that should be done in local newsrooms now.
Sure. Jill is so awesome. She's got the best memory of any of us, right? Yeah, I think Jill is referring to something I did when I worked in Boston, at WCVB TV in Boston, one of the great local TV stations in the country. You know, there are a handful of markets in the country that are considered like just, if you have an opportunity to work there, experience that, then do that. And Boston is one of those markets, and WCVB is one of those TV stations, which arguably, I think, from a journalistic standpoint, WCVB does it right most of the time. It is a standard bearer in our profession. So this is a quality news organization. And so we were having a particular challenge after the Charles Stewart murder case. It was a case in Boston in which a white man killed his wife, but said a black guy did. And then for days and for weeks, the ugliness of that allegation exposed a lot of tension and biases in Boston. Anyway, coming out of that and everyone, you know, looking at how we could have done our job better, I was asked to look at the makeup of our news organization. It has interesting discoveries. So besides the fact that the staff was overwhelmingly white, like 98+% white staff, in the community that's far more diverse than that. There were no people of color in senior management and in the decision-making process. So by the time someone like me got the assignment, the cast for the day has already been set. Other observations that we made in other places where one can make the argument that we weren't being fully sensitive to the needs of that market. So most TV stations, there's a weather section of the broadcast, and there's usually a beauty shot, right? Something that symbolizes if it's snowing outside, if it's whatever it is, a photographer is assigned to go out and get some beauty shots reflective of that day. And so for this particular month, I think it was in November, one year in Boston, a number where a ratings month where most TV stations across the country present their best selves. They're most serious about their work during that month because it's a ratings period. So in that month of November, these weather shots that are supposed to symbolize a day, what the day looks like in a pretty place. Not a single one of those images for the month of November took place in urban Boston. Not a single one of those images took place in what was a minority community. Another interesting thing that occurred when doing stories about a snowstorm that occurred that month. Not a single story about the snowstorm included a person of color. Black, Latino, Asian. So in my mind, the miraculous news was that in a record-setting snowstorm, somehow Black people, Latinos, Asians were not impacted at all by this record snowfall. Even in sports, where you would think it's just about, you know, effort and performance and excellence. There is a segment called Unsung Hero that they would do once a week where they would look at typically a high school athlete. And even there was a narrative of bias that in those nights in which the athlete chosen was an athlete of color, part of their narrative was about the pathology of their life, extreme poverty, dysfunction in their home, violence perhaps they had endured or witnessed. But if the athlete were white, that was never the narrative. It was about them being a good kid, a good student, an overachiever, a leader. And so there was something else I noticed in the reporting that month, that regardless of what the story was, if we were talking to someone in the community, right, because we're always told to find regular folk to create a narrative. For that month in November in Boston, at this leading TV station with outstanding journalists, not a single conversation with a person of color took place inside their home. It was on the sidewalk, maybe on the porch. And so one could draw from that could conclude that Black people, Latinos, and Asians in Boston don't own homes. They don't have living rooms that people sit in and have conversations. They don't gather around their kitchen table to solve problems. And the last thing I'll say about that report, there was, and when we talked about the experts, it was amazing how white men, at least in Boston for that particular month in November, are expert at almost everything. That it seemed like the Army motto, be all that you can be, only applied to white men, because they were presented as experts in every imaginable field. Were women, not as much. People of color, in a very singular lane if the issue was race. Hispanics, only if the issue related to immigration. This is in the 80s. And Asians, never, not once, as if they didn't exist. And so I said, if someone from Mars landed on Earth and they watched this great TV station, the station of record in this great market, they would be left to conclude that Black people, brown people, people of color don't own homes, aren't knowledgeable, aren't expert at anything. They're not drawn to live near beauty. And their only narrative to their lives is pathology, some awful experience. Now, if that were true, then this great TV station was spot on. But if it's not true, and I think most reasonable, decent people recognize fully that wasn't true. So look at all these opportunities that we've missed as journalists in the simple things that we do day to day. So forget about how we cover the George Floyd case and the Trump administration, or forget those big volatile things that occur. What are we doing day to day in the simple places, in the small corners of our broadcast and our show? And I remember after my presentation, this is the reaction that I got. Again, this is in the late 80s. Curiosity, surprise, frustration, disappointment. People felt attacked. I remember one colleague, whose name I won't name, but a respected senior journalist, says, "So Byron, basically you're calling us all racist, is what you're doing." I thought, okay. So it was a reminder again that these are complicated issues. And so if we, in looking at ourselves and how we operate, if we're uncomfortable having those conversations, but yet we're so cavalier in how we cover other people who are living in the midst of those moments, I think for me, the experience was revealing, it was humbling, and I want to believe that WCV was a great station before I got there, it was a great station after I left. But I think the newsroom benefited from that kind of analysis of what we did. And there was an effort made to address some of those things. That maybe on a beautiful sunny day, we can go to the rough and tumble section of town and show something beautiful.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think, I hope that we have come further than today, but I think that kind of analysis could happen in any newsroom right now. It doesn't take a fancy social scientist. It takes some curiosity and some looking inward, because honestly, ethics and inclusion and diversity are inseparable. Like you cannot be an ethical organization if you're not an inclusive organization. So Byron, thank you so very much for sharing your time with us today. I deeply, deeply appreciate it. I wish you the best of luck wherever you are flying to from the airport. And thank you for sharing your time with our students this week as well. We hope to get you on campus when the world gets back to whatever our new normal is.
Thank you. I'm honored. Now, if I text you soon, it's because I need bail money. I'm getting the stink eye again. But it's been an honor. Continued grace and success to you. It was such an honor to be a part of the journalism program at the University of Wisconsin. It's one of the best in the country. I know that because I know I'm familiar with a lot of journalism programs. So you should know you're doing great work. You're preparing great students. The students should know that they're receiving a world-class education. The people in the community should know that the young people, when they leave that university, will represent Madison, will represent the university in a brilliant fashion. And our profession will be made better by them. So thank you, my friend. Continue grace. All the best.
All right. Thank you so much, Byron. Bye-bye. Well, thank you, everybody. What a great that could have gone on for days, but what a great session. And I do apologize that we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but we have plenty more coming up. We're going to launch immediately into our next panel on innovations in journalism and some of the ethical questions that arise. So let me invite into the room our moderator, Joseph Lichterman, and I will introduce Joseph, and then he will set about leading his panel and introducing his panelists. So welcome, Joseph. Thank you so very much for being with us and leading this session.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. This is hopefully going to be a great conversation.
Absolutely. I'm counting on it. So Joseph is the Lenfest Institute's Communication and Editorial Director. He writes Solution Set, which he describes as a weekly-ish newsletter on innovations in journalism. It's a must-read in my email inbox, so I hope all of you will consider subscribing, and we'll throw a link to the subscription into the chat for all of you. So Joseph started out as a journalist. He was a staff writer for the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard. He also previously reported for Reuters in its Detroit bureau. He is a Michigan Wolverine and was editor of the Michigan Daily. You know, we Badgers, we'll accept you. We'll definitely accept you. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you and your panelists. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, and I'm thrilled to be here, and I'll introduce everyone. We don't need to talk about Big Ten football because it'll just make me sad, but we have a really outstanding panel, and I'm excited to introduce them. First, I'll introduce everyone. We are here with Sarah Lomax Reese, who is the president and CEO of WURD Radio in Philadelphia and the co-founder of URL Media, Lauren Gustus, who is the executive editor of the Salt Lake Tribune, Manuel Torres, who is a regional editor at the Marshall Project, and Ayan Mitra, who is the Texas Tribune editor. And so we have a really great conversation planned, and we're going to touch on some of the innovations that these amazing group of folks are working on in journalism at the local level. And I was hoping to start by asking each of you to talk a little bit about one of the things that I think has been one of the major focuses for news organizations in recent years as they focus on trust in the community. There's been, Byron made this point in his talk, that unlike national journalists who maybe fly in or fly out, local journalists are based in their communities and have to see the same folks in the pickup line at school or in the grocery store. And would be curious to hear from you, as news organizations are thinking around building business models that are built on membership donations and subscriptions, and making sure that their journalism is reflective of the community. To each of you, I guess, how do you think about how you ensure that you are embedding trust and engagement into your work? And Lauren, you're immediately next to me on the screen, so why don't we start with you, and we can circle around from there.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be here. I think this work that you're talking about is everyday work, right? And it's incremental, and it takes a commitment. And one of the things we've started to do, I'm relatively new at the Salt Lake Tribune. I previously worked in California at the Sacramento Bee as its editor, and we did the same thing in Sacramento. We have to shift our mental approach such that we are writing for the communities that we serve versus about the communities that we serve. And as journalists, we are supposed to be right. We are supposed to have all of the answers, and we are not supposed to make a mistake, right? We issue a correction, okay, that's fine. But it's kind of built into us, right? That we are supposed to be right. And so letting go of that and letting others set the direction of a story is a really interesting process, in my view, to work through with a reporter. But at the outcome stage of the process, right, and when you finally do get to publication, it's so much better than if you had just presumed you know the answers, or you know where you're going to go for that next quote, and so on and so forth. So how do we do it? Well, pre-pandemic, we asked folks, everyone in our newsroom, to go out and get a coffee with someone they didn't know. And might that person be someone they wouldn't perhaps think about speaking with? And how might we build a more diverse source list by asking everyone to find at least once a week someone that they hadn't spoken with for an agenda-free conversation right? No interview, no on the record. Just let me get to know you as a professional, as a person, someone from the other side of town, but relevant to your beat in some way. And then might we ask them if they would work with us to build a more diverse source list. And we shared that with the whole newsroom. We did that in conjunction with the source audit, which was very helpful. One of the other things we did, and then I will hand off, here in Utah was to launch a partnership with our local community college to elevate voices from community college students in our publications, right? We call it Amplify Utah. We're drawing from the most diverse community college in the state. And we are workshopping stories with these reporters so they get the experience of working with an editor at the Salt Lake Tribune. And then we are elevating the story and we're publishing it across the state and we're making it available to our partners across the state. So these voices that perhaps we would not have found previously, and stories we certainly would not have found previously, are being elevated to a greater diversity of folks. And that feels really good. We've just published our first set of stories this week, and we'll continue to move through that process with Salt Lake Community College here moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Lauren. And Manuel, same question to you. And the Marshall Project's in a little bit of a different position because you are a national organization, but covering a specific topic, which is criminal justice.
Right. One thing I will mention that's particular in our case, but not just our organization, everybody in our coverage, we all interact with communities. In our case, what I will add to the conversation is that, part of our effort to build trust is to make sure that we are careful in how we tell the stories of folks who we are writing about or interviewing or reflecting their stories. And I mean that because I say that because we deal with a lot of vulnerable communities, people who are in prison, for example, for whom speaking out, even about the conditions they're facing, could be dangerous in many ways, or you can put them at risk of retaliation. The guards themselves, the people who work in prisons, when they want to expose conditions, of working conditions, or how people are being housed there that are not fair or that are terrible, they face retribution from their employers when they speak out. So, and finally, the people we often write stories about folks who have faced trauma, whether they are victims of violence or have been convicted of a violent act, for example. So all of these communities that we interact with, we need to be careful in how we tell their stories. So one thing we do is we talk to them and we are very mindful of obtaining their consent to tell the story, but informed consent. What I mean by that is, we talk to them about what it means that this story is going to be published on our website, but also we partner with a variety of news organizations, ranging from very small local organizations to national and international organizations like the New York Times or the BBC or the Guardian. And so thousands, if not millions of people are going to see your story. We want to make sure that they understand the potential consequences of that, not only personally, but down the road. Everything that goes on the web lives on the web for such a long time. So one quick example I'll give, we just recently did a series about the use of police dogs and the terrible consequences that has for many people, most of them accused of hardly anything, if at all. So when we in the series, maybe we have about a dozen stories that we share of different people, including video of their attack. And so we interview many more than those. We selected these 12 or these 11 or 12 that we use specifically, that we identify. Each of them, our reporters have multiple conversations with them, with their attorneys, for the ones who also had attorneys, explaining, this is going to go on TV, this is going to go on the web. People are going to see it. Are you comfortable talking about this experience? Trying to make sure that we were not re-traumatizing people by what will happen once the story goes live, and making sure that they understood why they wanted to talk. Not that we don't assume people don't know why, but that they understood, again, just the potential impact and consequences of that work. So that's how we feel we gain trust, and the word gets out. People in prisons where we have done some work, other people in those prisons are contacting us and say, hey, you guys did a story about this. I got another problem, and here's another thing. They trust us with their stories because we're careful this way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that trust begets trust in a sense. So if you're able to make those relationships stick. It'll lead to more stories. And Sarah, for you and Word Radio, you are the only African American owned radio station in Pennsylvania, one of the few in the country. And so you're serving a targeted community. And I be curious how you're thinking about trust within that framework, and how you approached the work you do at the station there.
Sure. Thanks, Yossi. It's great to be a part of this conversation. Just a tiny point of clarification: we're the only African American owned talk radio station in Pennsylvania. So I always have to clarify that. I'll take the broader opportunity, but it is talk. So I'm a big proponent of ownership. I think that trust and ownership can oftentimes go hand in hand. And so whenever anybody asks me a question about how do you cultivate trust in communities, particularly communities that have been historically underrepresented or treated unfairly by the mainstream press, whether it's through being caricatured or stereotyped or ignored, I always go back to this notion of ownership. And there's a long history dating back to before Frederick Douglass, who started the North Star newspaper, and in the I think it was in the 1840s. I think 1827 was the date of the first African American newspaper that was started. But there's this long history of African American press advocating for the humanity of Black people, and that notion of ownership and having the agency and the freedom to speak and speak for and about and to your audience because you were not represented fairly or accurately or even at all in other media. So my family owns WURD. I've been running it for 10 years. And that my personal legacy, where my father was a physician, he literally treated many people in the African American community. And when he bought the station, it was considered a kind of continuation of his commitment and care of the community to give the Black community a voice and a place where we could really embrace and express our full humanity. So I think ownership is a very important part of trust. I think centering people, their own stories as valid and valuable is critical. And being able to create spaces where people, regardless of their education, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of their position in society, they have an ability to speak and be heard. And that is what WURD does very well. We don't, and maybe sometimes I wish we did, but we don't screen our calls, so people can call in and say their piece. And, there was a really powerful moment earlier this week. We had just been processing, the Derek Chauvin verdict and the police shooting of Ma'Khia Bryant in Ohio, where she apparently had a knife, and so there's questions about that whole situation. And a caller called in, an older Black man called in and talked about his personal experience as a foster child, which this young woman was, 16-year-old young woman was a foster. She was in a foster care situation. He talked about how he had a very similar personal experience as a young person, where he was crying out for help in so many different ways, and ended up, ultimately, he was being bullied, ended up taking a knife to school, and it was all like a cry for help. And so it was just so powerful to have this real life personal experience shared, and we create those kinds of platforms. And I think that is our value, to allow people to process their pain, their grief, and their joy at the same time, as a collective and as a community. And the last thing I'll say is, we're constantly listening to our community, and creating programming and initiatives in response to what we're hearing. And so I think that that's another way that we create trust, is that we hear people are, people need jobs. So we created an initiative called Livelihood that connects our community to jobs and career opportunities and small business resources. We, hear people are struggling with the rising violence in the Black community in Philadelphia during the pandemic. And so we've created all of these initiatives around violence prevention and disruption. So I think that is, being responsive and acknowledging and letting your community know that you're not just, you don't just hear them, but you're actually listening, and you are being, you're acting on the information that's being shared. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. That was terrific. And I will definitely have follow-up questions for you as we continue about Livelihood and other initiatives as well. So thank you for that outstanding introduction. And talking about ownership, the Texas Tribune is a little bit of a different model, where it's a statewide nonprofit and collaborates and shares coverage with other organizations throughout Texas. And so I'd be curious to hear more about your work there and how you're thinking about embedding engagement and trust into that reporting as well.
Yes, thanks for having us. And I'm not sure that I can improve on anything that's already been said, but I'll give it a shot. So one thing I'll talk about from our perspective is about clarity of mission, knowing what we do and what we don't do. And so, the mission of the Tribune is kind of focused on state government and state systems and policy areas. And what our primary goal is to try to make government and systems more accessible to the residents of Texas. And so we do that obviously through our journalism. What we're trying to do is, use our coverage to not just focus on the debates, but also focus on the people being impacted by these policy issues in the debates. And also making it clear that just because there's one school finance bill doesn't mean that every Texan is affected the same way. So we try to go and show how different people are affected differently by the same legislation. We try to bring an explanatory lens to a lot of our work. During the pandemic, for example, we did a big explainer on how to navigate unemployment assistance. People are very intimidated by government and government systems and how to navigate them. And what we try to do is try to make it more accessible, make our audience understand better how it works and how to interact with it. And also, we're trying to also help people make their voice heard too. And we really value the aspect of two-way conversation. When there's not a pandemic, we're going across the state and holding events across the state. We try to go to where people are. We partner with community colleges, with communities to have dialogues to bring lawmakers closer to the constituencies that they represent. So there's added accountability for them. We're moderating events, but we're also every event that we're hosting always includes a segment where audience members can bring their questions to the forefront as well. So we're trying to do things like that. We're also just trying to bring information as easily as possible to people, so they don't have to work hard to access it. As you mentioned, all of our journalism is available to be republished for free. So newspapers across the state are able to, even if they don't have people covering, the state capitol or the legislature, there should be no news deserts. And so that's what we're trying to kind of help by making that content accessible. And, as we're trying to always innovate too, to kind of reach people where they want without being intrusive. And I think an example of that too is during this recent winter storm in February that kind of completely blanketed the state, and people were not getting the answers they needed from government officials. We set up a text alert system to where people could opt in to get text alerts about what the latest is going on with the power grid. So, I think we're trying to reach people where they are in different ways, and trying to also, whether it's through call outs or other methods, trying to also make sure that we're hearing what people need to learn about their government and things that we can also provide, better information and journalism on.
Thank you. Yeah, I do not live in Texas, but signed up for the text message alerts mostly because I'm a journalism nerd, and it was a phenomenal service and interesting to see how it's continued to evolve after those initial storms also. And I think one of the interesting things, we think about innovation, we think about new apps or technical gizmos, things like that, but it can also be innovative in terms of how we do the journalism and the language we use to do the journalism as well. And there is a project at the Marshall Project that recently launched called the Language Project, which is an effort to clarify the language used while reporting on the criminal justice system. And the intro to that project says, "We are not an advocacy organization, but we are committed to sustaining a sense of national urgency about the US criminal justice system." And so, Manuel, you touched on this a little bit in your intro, but curious how you think about using language as an innovation almost at the Marshall Project, and how do you balance between wanting to come across as journalists who are doing reporting versus that sense that it might be perceived as advocacy, I suppose?
Good questions. I'll address the first part of that first. So, the Language Project, it's an effort that has been led by our editor, one of our editors, Akiva Solomon, has done a terrific job with it. This is a conversation that we began internally at the Marshall Project a couple of years back, actually like into 2015, 2016, when we started encountering in our reporting, in our conversations with people who are in prison, and even with correctional officers, for example, complaints, frankly, or conversations about people who were taking issue with how the language that we were using in our stories, using words like inmate or words like, felon or and so on. And so they were making the point that, those words, certain words, define people by something they may have done or they did for the rest of their lives. That was one point they were making. And also that they group people, or they tend to dehumanize people. And for many of these folks, these words are used or are seen as almost slurs. And depending on their circumstance or the situation, really severe slurs. And so we engaged in some conversation at that point where we didn't make official decisions about what language to use or not to use. We have now. And the idea for us is that journalism is a profession of clarity, right? We all want to be clear about the language we use. We want to be precise, and we want our language to mean what people think it means. I'll give you an example. So there are almost 500,000 people who are in jails across the United States right this very moment who are not convicted of anything. They're there because they cannot afford bail, or they're waiting for trial. They have been denied bail, but they're waiting for trial. They presume innocent until proven guilty under our principles of our constitutional principles. However, when we talk about inmates, technically every one of those people is an inmate in a jail. That's just the technical term. But the word, when used in the context of journalism and reporting, tend to connote guilt or culpability. If you're in jail, many people presume you're in there because you did something. Well, that's something that hasn't yet been legally determined. You may be, innocent, you may be guilty, but the word in itself connote that. So that's what we're trying to foster, just a conversation about the words that we use and other ways that can be both more clear journalistically, while at the same time conveying to readers what we mean. Now, as far as the distinction between advocacy and journalists, we're not trying to be the language police, or no, absolutely not. This is an invitation to organizations to just think about how they cover, and as you mentioned, we make that very clear. The Marshall Project is not an advocacy organization. We are a journalist organization, and the distinction is that we follow the facts, and we are willing to follow the facts wherever they go. So if the premise that you start an investigation with is that, say, conditions at this jail are terrible, or that people are being mistreated, or there are constitutional violations going on, and your reporting discovered that that is not the case, or that there is all these other factors that have led to this situation, that's what we report. So the difference to me is that an advocacy organization looks for facts that support an argument. A journalist organization looks for facts that tell whatever the truth happens to be. And we as journalists, objectivity of individuals is really just a concept. We all come into stories with preconceived notions, whether they are conscious or unconscious, or however, what we can do is an objectivity of process. So we use journalistic principles. We practice journalism. We report. We interview everybody involved in the issue. We have a strict fact-checking and editing processes. If we're doing accountability investigations, whatever agency or people are the ones who are involved, who are alleged to have been doing some wrongdoing. We make sure that we compile all our findings. We talk to them. We present our findings before we publish anything. We go to them and say, this is what we think we found. Prove it wrong. Is there anything here we're not considering? So just quickly to wrap up, I'll give you an example. In this investigation we did about the police using police dogs across the country with terrible consequences, as I mentioned. Every one of those departments, sheriff's offices, police agencies that are mentioned, we went to them with the data, with the numbers they have provided about the incidents and how many people have been bitten and all of that. And we gave them an ample opportunity to talk about what these numbers, what do they think the numbers show? What were the factors? What are the policies? We talked to individual officers. We talked to trainers. We talked to experts from police think tanks. Our stories reflect, for example, that why is it that police use these dogs? How many officers see the dogs as a way to protect their own safety by sending a dog into a building, say, when there is someone there? What our reporting show, however, that in many of those cases, it may not have been warranted, but still, we wanted to include that point of view to reflect an advocacy organization trying to advocate, say, for the end of police dogs will not have done that part of the process, but that's how we believe journalism demands.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fascinating, and I know we'll have some questions on that from the group afterward. And Lauren, I wanted to ask you similarly about a recent initiative at the Tribune. There's this discussion about facts, and facts are obviously at the center of that of everything we do as journalists. And previously, a lot of newsrooms would only alter a story or change anything because of factual error, for example. But recently, the Tribune announced a project just last month, actually, that you'd begin considering requests from people who want their names or images removed from past coverage. So I was hoping you might be able to explain the thinking behind that initiative and that process and why you decided to introduce that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I'm sure anyone who's on this call who's involved in the day-to-day of a news organization has received a request from someone who asks them to remove, right, a piece of content, a whole story, you name it, right? And we found that we were kind of handling them in a one-off capacity, and it didn't really feel consistent, right? To Manuel's point about how do we take an objective, right, and process-oriented approach, even if we acknowledge that we all bring bias to our conversations, right? And so we started with a review of our ethics policy just to see where we had left off with respect to requests to remove, right, content and take down policies, so to speak. And reporters initiated that process, which I think was an important component of where we landed by way of policy, and that it was really driven by the newsroom, not those who would ultimately be making the call, and not by me, who ultimately makes the call on any of these requests. So we started with a review of our ethics policy, which led us down another rabbit hole, which was, let's review the whole ethics policy, which we should do. And I feel like any news organization should do on a regular basis. Took some time, but was really valuable by way of moving us forward, right? We realized that we were making one-off decisions as requests came in. That was not fair, and that was not equitable. We also recognized that the Tribune can have a lasting impact on those accused of minor or nonviolent crimes, or again, as just as we were talking about with the Marshall Project, there are many people who are incarcerated who have not yet been charged or who won't be charged, right? We studied what others had done, those who are farther along in the process, and that includes Cleveland, which has got a pretty interesting policy, and also Boston, the Boston Globe, and a team of Tribune reporters and editors worked for a couple of months to develop our new guidance and a new procedure for requests to have booking photos removed from stories, for requests to de-index stories from Google, for requests to unpublish stories. We did communicate when we communicated this new policy, and we did this broadly. We communicated it by writing a story about how we were changing our policy, by sharing the story, by re-sharing this story at different junctures, right? Because we don't presume we hit everybody, and by asking others to share what we were doing as well. But we did communicate that we thought that removal of stories would be rare, but that there's opportunities for us to look at how we might make adjustments, especially in the minor nonviolent crime space. One of the things that I think we talked about when we were preparing for this session was, did this happen because the Tribune is a nonprofit, right? Do we decide to go down this road and to publish an updated policy with respect to requests for removal, and to be a little bit more proactive as we look at doing so? I believe that as a for-profit or a nonprofit, we are a business, and we must be sustainable if we are to be here for years to come, right? Everyone in our organization should know what that North Star is and what our plan is to get there, right? And yet, we cannot be sustainable if we are not relevant and if we do not put our communities at the center of any decision that we make, right? If the reporting is not accessible, if it is not essential, if it is not fair, then our communities will not support us. And so, as far as, how we get there, I think it does start with deep listening. And one of the signals that we picked up was, in a few of these requests that had come in, and our recognition that we weren't being equitable as we looked at how we adjudicated them. So now we have a 3-person panel. They hear everyone, they send their recommendations to me, and we move forward with each one of those in a one-to-one capacity. It hasn't taken as much time as we thought it would. It's been a fairly seamless process so far. I'm sure we'll run into, a few that will perhaps be a little bit more labor intensive, but for the most part, it's been a nice transition, and it's been well received by both the community and the staff.
Thanks, Lauren. That's fascinating. I think we don't often think about, or we need to think more about how we publish and how people are accessing information, and delisting things from Google and things like that can keep the historic record without making it the first thing that shows up when people search their name. So I think that's a fascinating distinction. And for those who don't know, Lauren touched on this, the Salt Lake Tribune is now a nonprofit. So it recently converted from a for-profit model to a nonprofit model, and is now able to be supported by the community and philanthropy as well. And the Texas Tribune, from one Tribune to the other, was one of the pioneers in this model as a nonprofit, and for over a decade now has been accepting donations and support from the community. And obviously the newsroom is separate from the business side of things. There's no influence on the coverage, but I was hoping you could talk a little bit and tell us a bit about some of the safeguards that are in place and how you communicate that to the community to ensure that they know that even though you have donors and supporters and nonprofits and others who are supporting the work, that it doesn't influence the journalism.
Yeah, I think, in a simple answer to that, the answer is transparency for us, is like to try to be as upfront as possible about kind of who supports the work we do. Any piece of journalism that we produce, whether it's story, videos, data visualizations, if there is a mention of someone who has given us either in kind or other types of financial support, we disclose them within the content that we produce, and it's a very clear explanation that says that that this organization or this member or donor has been a financial supporter, but they don't play any part in the role of our journalism. We have a very distinct development team who works very hard to get support for the work that we do, and they make zero promises to anyone about like what that means in terms of anything other than like you are supporting the work that the Tribune does. And people support the work because they're not finding at least the level of what we do elsewhere, and they want to continue that. And so in terms of there's that wall where we're not involved with any of that in terms of like the editorial side. We're moderating events which are sponsored, but that's not all we're doing, is kind of dealing with the editorial content of those things and not really involved with any of the aspects. And so the main thing is when When we start an event, we're very clear about, who sponsors and how they have no input on the questioning or the selection of the panels, things like that. And we also feel very strongly about, that this gets you, that there's no access, even though sometimes like some people may think they get some types of access. And so I think you can tell from our coverage, there are entities that may have been supporters who have been, who may not have liked something that we've done, and that's not our problem. As an editorial organization, that's just our job is to bring accountability regardless. And so I think our journalism reflects that kind of that there's no, we're here to bring accountability and explanatory journalism when it comes to state government and state systems and the people that they impact. And so we're very transparent about who has given us money. That the full list of people who have donated money to the Tribune is on our site. You can see that through whether it's a foundation, whether it's through our membership program, whether it's through corporate sponsorship of events. We don't hide from that because we have nothing to hide from, because this is support for the work that we do, but it has no impact on the work that we do, other than the financial donations to the organization.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And totally coincidentally, I was having a conversation with Terry Quinn, who leads fundraising at the Tribune this week. And she told me that it's not uncommon, or it's happened, that the Tribune will say no to potential donors or supporters because what they want to do doesn't align with the mission, that really the mission and the journalism comes first.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important point.
Excellent. And Sarah, you touched on this in your introduction about programs like Livelihood and providing resources and access to support for the listeners and WURD's audience. I noticed, for example, on your website this week, you're running a program offering free colorectal cancer screenings as well, because there's higher prevalence of the disease in the African American community. And I was hoping you could tell us a bit about the thinking behind efforts like that, and why you see that the station's role is not just to cover or discuss the news, but to provide those resources to community members, and how that fits in with your mission.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess, I was listening to Manuel about journalism versus advocacy. And I would say, we definitely are advocating for things at Word. We are advocating for, better health outcomes. We're advocating for access, more equity in economic resources. We're advocating for criminal justice, equality, and reform, police. We are advocating for things that disproportionately disadvantage Black people. And so, and again, looking historically, that has been the role of the Black press, is to starting with the advocacy of abolition, trying to advocate for the eradication of slavery so that Black people were seen as full human beings. So we are a part of that tradition. And there are so many issues that confront the Black community in very tangible and personal and persistent ways that we do see ourselves as a bridge, as a connector between resources and opportunities and our community, because Philadelphia is about 45% Black, and it is what you would call a majority minority city. But it's also the poorest big city in the country. And the unemployment rates are ridiculous, particularly in the Black community. And so the needs in our community in Philadelphia and the Black community are so urgent that we feel at WURD that it is very much a part of our mission and our reason for being to try and step into these issues in a way that's not just about coverage, but about connecting and serving. And so Livelihood, as I mentioned earlier, is looking specifically at the racial wealth gap. It's looking specifically at these high unemployment rates, because even though we're the poorest big city and we're one of the blackest cities, there are tons of resources that exist in Philadelphia, tons of resources, but they often don't get to the people who need them the most. And so we see ourselves as that gap filler, or that bridge to try and connect people with all of these resources, and also to hold the powerful accountable to the people. And so Livelihood was created specifically to address the high unemployment rates in the Black community by leveraging all of our platforms at Word. We have, radio AM and FM. We have our app. We have our website, wordradio.com. We also have a Livelihood website that is called wordworks.com. And really using all of these platforms. We also have EcoWord, which you're very familiar with, Yossi, which is our environmental justice initiative. And so we want to use all of these platforms to connect the Black community and Black Philadelphians up with jobs, career readiness, small business resources, financial literacy, as a way to try and create more equity around wealth creation, as well as unemployment and access to jobs. The colorectal cancer, we call it, our initiative is called Go to Know, and it's a bit of a test to see, can we do the same thing? It's almost like a public health campaign. Colorectal cancer, Black people are diagnosed at much higher rates, die more frequently from it, and it's almost 100% curable if it's caught early. So it's one of those cancers that if you are able to intervene and detect it early, there's a really great potential for a positive outcome. And so we partnered with Penn Medicine, which is one of the largest healthcare organizations in the city, Independence Blue Cross Foundation, another huge insurer in Philadelphia, LabCorp, which is the testing organization, and the Colorectal Cancer Alliance, and collaborated to do this very targeted outreach and education campaign to the Black community as a way to try and see if can we actually maybe save some people's lives. And to me, that is, I don't know if it's journalism or advocacy, but it's what I'm committed to doing through my work at Word and our work at Word.
Thank you, Sarah. I love that framing of using the platforms as a way to connect the community and bring resources to bear to help people navigate their lives and the challenges they're facing. So I could ask you questions all morning, but I want to turn it over to some of the really excellent questions that are coming in from the chat. And this is really for anyone. Susie Nexus asks, what challenges are there to doing this work, either within the news organizations themselves or within the communities, especially with rampant distrust that people have with journalists? Do you get a lot of pushback? Hashtag enemy of the people, that type of thing, given the broader mistrust of news and journalism, I suppose. So how are you thinking of navigating that, if anyone wants to take that?
I'll briefly tell you. We don't, the whole hashtag enemy of the people thing. I mean, I think, I don't know if what others face in the individual organizations. That's not something we see on the field necessarily. Our reporters, they're not feeling, but it might be different for reporters covering like other things like protests and other things that put them more in contact with certain segments of the public out there that may believe or may reflect that view. We are very aware that, certain things that should not be or really have no reason to be politicized are, when it comes to the criminal justice system, for example. It's interesting because over the last couple of decades, and especially in the last 10 years, you've seen a movement where, the efforts to change the system and, say, reduce incarceration, for example, have come both from very liberal quarters, but also very conservative ones for totally different reasons. Libertarians, fiscal conservatives on one side, and more human rights abolitionists, say, on the other end of the spectrum. And so, from our perspective, when you have some topic like that, but yet a lot of the public still doesn't know or have not known the length of the severity of the problem. So, the issue of trust emerges more along the lines of, does our coverage include and reflects all these different points of view and motivations that have to do with this issue? That's we're a single issue newsroom, if you will. The criminal justice system is vast, and it includes multiple things: policing, prisons, etc. But we don't see, the actual difficulties of the day-to-day job. They're not along the lines of like, we don't want to have anything to do with you. It's more along the lines of, can we break through the noise? Can we include all these points of view and advance the conversation?
I just add that I think there's an opportunity with local news to move from the narrative that persists across the country with respect to how much journalists are or aren't trusted, which has been a great topic of debate even this week, right? And we can do that by focusing on things that matter to everyone. How clean is your water? How clean is your air? How long does it take you to get downtown from your house? Because, Salt Lake is growing incredibly fast and there's more traffic. Those things, one would hope, if we do them responsibly, those stories are depoliticized, right? And there's a strain of journalism or type of journalism that we like to use in Salt Lake, and it's called high utility, right? How can you help me navigate to my best experience today in Salt Lake? And we can build trust by being, providing a path for people in that high utility journalism space. What are the 10 best restaurants to eat outside, right? We've probably all seen that in our local communities, right? That's hopefully not political, and hopefully, it can help us to build trust such that when we do hit the bigger topics, the meatier topics, people will come with us because perhaps we've given them an opportunity to experience us in a different capacity such that they're familiar with us and perhaps they already have a degree of trust in the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that we're not seeing, I think it's like it's in the eye of the beholder kind of thing, because in the Black community, I think we're seeing pretty heroically because we are seen as like champions for the people, but we have also gotten threats. We've gotten, like hate mail and just very concerning, feedback from people who don't believe that our position in terms of really serving the Black community is something that they embrace. And so I think that when you are super serving a particular community, and we live in such racially polarized times, that it invites some pushback. But within the community that we are trying to serve, I think that we're not seen as the enemy of the people, quite the opposite.
I'll just briefly add on all these responses are great. I just it's really interesting in this era of Twitter too, where a lot of folks are also kind of talking past you too. That it's just there's it's interesting because of some are willing to engage in a way that's actually like that we're and I think we've all probably got these phone calls or emails where there's something that's very a charged response, and once you kind of explain kind of the context of the reporting that you've done on a piece or something like that, then there's a follow-up conversation or email that basically says, oh, well, I didn't see it that way. And so, if there's an opportunity to have a respectful kind of dialogue on the issues, which sometimes it's just not going to be there, but I think we are often, there's often a defensive response, and we have to see where there's an opportunity to engage in respectful dialogue and constructive dialogue, and see if there's a chance, there's a possibility that we miss something, because there are often times that we do. And so, I think if we can, we want to make sure we're engaging, and people are having a spot to do respectful dialogue, and if they're able to kind of respectfully kind of share their viewpoints, then we want to engage in that. But like the name calling and stuff that it's just not productive, and so we kind of disengage from that.
Terrific. Thank you, everyone. Our next question is from Manuel and comes from Sharon Dunwoody. And the question is, reporting in a way that permits a journalist to test her or his prior assumptions about what is true is very difficult. How do you encourage reporters to actually achieve that?
That's a good question. So a lot of what we do, I heard once Ira Glass, the host of This American Life, was being interviewed, and somebody was talking and asking, how is it that your show is so good? And he said, well, you should see all the stories we kill. And we do a lot of that too. It's every investigative reporter, a lot of what we do is investigative journalism and accountability journalism, and everybody digs a dry hole or a dry well often. And so, we, in some cases, for many news organizations, this is a bit of a luxury, but we do dedicate the time to probe, to look and see if we're not seeing anything there. And by anything, I don't mean if we're not seeing what we thought we were going to see. That's not what I mean. But if there's really, like, if we think this is not going to be the kind of interesting story, there doesn't seem to be wrongdoing here, or have we probed enough to be able to build and get a story that is of the quality and of the high standards that we have. So a lot of what we do is explore. Our reporters sometimes obtain some data, and we look at the data and analyze the data. And if the initial premise is not borne and it's not proven by the data, then we either, if it warrants writing it, we do. If it's something that's, it's just not a topic, then let's spend the time digging something that actually is more interesting or actual news. So that's what I will say. You should see the amount of stories or ideas that we weed out or kill or just don't advance. That's something I will say.
Excellent, thank you. And then I think we have time for one last question, and this comes from Lindsay Palmer, and this is actually a great question given the makeup of the panel. What challenges would you say are unique to doing this important work in the nonprofit context versus the context of being a for-profit outlet? And since we have 3 nonprofits and 1 for-profit outlet here, would be curious to get any of your sense on this.
I'll take the first crack, which is, I think as we all know in nonprofit world, like it's just, there's a constant, there's the fundraising aspect, which is constant, which which is always a part of the organization, which, fortunately for us in editorial side, we're not involved in, but for from the aspect of, we are all often competing with, with the newsroom that's we're trying to seek balance, I guess is the right word to say, and like trying to make sure we're matching our ambition with our bandwidth and abilities, and making sure we have a proper balance. For example, the winter storm that hit, I'll use that as an example again. This was something where we were fortunate because we have writers on staff who are very familiar with the power grid, how that operates, and things like that. But this is not something that we were just generally equipped to deal with on in a breaking news basis. And so a lot of people had to become quick studies on things that they weren't familiar with very quickly, in terms of giving the context that our audiences needed, and people people who were losing power, trying to figure out when they were going to get power back and what the process was. And so trying to get that kind of information in a way, in the demands of what our audience needed is always going to be a challenge, because we have to be nimble and flexible. We're set up with a focus on very specific policy and politics areas, and so when a pandemic hits the country and the state, and we are set up with our newsroom isn't set up to have with a bunch of health writers. There's a learning curve that we have to get get on quick. And so I think it's always a matter of resources and making sure you're kind of balancing them properly to make sure you're answering the demands of what the news cycle may be at a certain point. And with nonprofits, there's, quite often like that we're just not staffed the way that other newsrooms are. And so, we're all often, calling on people who are doing multiple things to do add on to those things. And what we're finding now too is that, this, we have to work better at getting a balance when it comes to those things and being able to like prioritize and make sure that we're not overextending ourselves and making sure that we're kind of, keeping a balance for ourselves, our teams, so we're able to kind of cover things in a responsible and, in a way that doesn't burn us out.
As I guess the one for-profit in the mix, the first thing I would say is I'm encouraged that the firewall or the hard line between for-profit and nonprofit seems to be diminishing somewhat, because philanthropic funders are contributing, are funding for-profits in more ways now, particularly in the journalism space, than ever before. I know we have been the beneficiary of several grants that have been absolutely transformative for our ability to grow, and I appreciate the fact that particularly for BIPOC media organizations, there's an acknowledgement that there needs to be a little bit more flexibility around how these kinds of contributions are made if we are going to survive and move from like being on our heels to actually being centers of innovation. And so, but I also appreciate I'm a big proponent of for-profit because, as I said earlier, I believe in wealth creation as a way to balance out some of the historic socioeconomic disadvantages that have been that have come down very clearly along racial lines. And so I believe that the best way to create generational wealth and to try and balance these things out somewhat is to create thriving corporations and businesses that can then reinvest in whether it's other media or cultural institutions or other businesses within the within the African American community. I've seen how that works personally because my father was able to do some incredibly transformative things with the wealth that he was able to create through being involved in managed care. And so, I think that one of the things within the Black community, if we don't have more wealth in the Black community, it's very difficult to change the racial wealth gap that we are seeing right now, which is staggering. And so I'm looking at it in kind of a macro way, but hoping that in some ways for-profit media can play a role in that wealth creation equation, particularly in Black and Brown communities.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think regardless of what the tax status is, for-profit or nonprofit, it still needs to be run as a business, as we discussed, and community needs to be at the heart of all the journalism, which I think we heard from all our panelists today. And we are over time, I believe. So I think that will be it for us. Someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but thank you to all our panelists. This was a phenomenal conversation. And thank you to the center as well for putting on this day of sessions. It's been terrific. And hopefully next year we'll be able to gather together in person in Madison, which would be lovely. So thank you everyone for having us.
Thank you so much, Joseph. That was an absolutely fantastic panel. And I know our reach is expanded because we're virtual, but it's kind of killing me to not be connecting with folks in person. So yes, we will make every effort to have you here in Madison in person to work directly with our students, our faculty, and our industry partners. So thank you very much. I am delighted to kick off our final session today, which focuses on the Shadid curriculum. I am so honored to have the name Anthony Shadid attached to activities in the center. So if you're not already aware, each year we have 4 to 5 finalists and a winner of the Anthony Shadid Award for Journalism Ethics. Anthony was a graduate of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at UW-Madison, an advisory board member of the Center for Journalism Ethics, and one of the most respected international journalists of his time. Anthony always did his work with integrity, and which made him such a natural fit for the work that we do. We lost Anthony 9 years ago. He was reporting on the Arab Spring and the situation in Syria when he died. It was a tremendous loss, but we continually try to honor the work that he did and the ways that he did that work, the integrity that he brought to that work. And the Shadid Award has been an important part of that. So we had the fantastic idea that emerged from our advisory board to take all of this wonderful material that has come in for the Shadid Award and put it in some sort of form that it would have lasting meaning and long-term effect. And that became the Shadid curriculum. So I am delighted to have this session to introduce you to that curriculum. And I'm going to bring in our 2 guests, Luke Daniel Cross and Martha Mendoza. Luke is a student here, a PhD student here at UW-Madison, and in the School of Journalism. And excuse me, he is engaged in political communication and mass communication effects research. He earned a BA in political science and an MA in journalism, both from the University of South Florida, where he also did a lot of work in ethics. He's interested in transnational electoral information and political communication ethics. So thank you so much for being with us, Luke. Martha is part of a team, or was part of a team, whose investigations into slavery in the Thai seafood business led to the freedom of more than 2,000 men. She works with the Associated Press, and during her career, she's been based in Mexico City, Bangkok, Silicon Valley, New York, New Mexico, and now she's in sunny California. We can see the bright sun streaming in from your window, Martha. As part of the Associated Press's investigative team, she has done such important work, including Shadid Award-winning work. So welcome, Martha, as well. I'm going to kick it off and turn it to you, Luke. You did all the work in developing this curriculum, including figuring out ways to group the nominations and finalists, the nominations of finalists and winners. So tell us a little bit about how you approached this project, what you learned from it, and what you think it means.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I just want to reiterate a bit of what Katie said there about how many great pieces we had to work with when putting together the Shadid curriculum, because it was really both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness in a way. When I first approached the Shadid curriculum and started working on putting things together, the first instinct, of course, is to go through each article and give each one as its own individual module, so to speak, like treat each one as a discussion point and its own worksheet. But given the massive amount of great work that we had, because of how long the Shadid Award has been running, I thought it would be a disservice almost, just turn each piece into its own little module. So as Katie mentioned, I eventually, when sifting through the material, discovered that there were certain journalistic themes that arose. Because of course, they're all very different articles focusing on very different themes and different problems. But ultimately, they deal with some of the same issues, just in different formats, whether it be respecting the privacy of sources, whether it be to intervene in the story or not. We'll see that more as we go through the Shadid curriculum, and you get a short demonstration later. But essentially, we decided ultimately to group them into themes so that it would be more applicable to actual pedagogical use. So that if you are making a course, or if you're developing a course, or if you're bolstering an existing module, it might be worthwhile to have, instead of just a wide selection of articles where you have to skim through each one, to instead have broad themes that you can then choose from and get the insight from multiple journalists on those themes, instead of just having the perspective of one single. And this was really helped by the fact that each nomination came with a video submission from the journalist or the editor. And a big key in that was that I was able to go and dive into the lived experience and the actual issues that these journalists faced when they went through it in their own voice. And the videos themselves have been edited down a bit for brevity, but also included in with the modules themselves, so you can have access to that as well. But ultimately, the themes weren't just correlated and aggregated around broad topics. They were aggregated around the actual lived experiences and issues that the journalists faced in their challenges. Because ultimately, when developing this curriculum, we wanted something that was practical and applicable to mass comm ethics education courses. And the best way to get at that is to actually get the experience of these nominations, of these award winners for the Shadid Award. Because, as was mentioned a few times already, they are a literal gold mine for these sorts of issues. And alongside each part of the curriculum, it's developed into, or it's been organized into different themes and collected around different themes. But each one is also focusing on the articles that are within those themes. And each one comes with questions, mind you, that were partially developed by us as a team, and also partially from the journalists and editors' mouths themselves, submitted through the videos or through the nomination materials. And I thought that was just as important, because it's not just about highlighting the challenges that they overcame, it's also about highlighting the questions that are still there, the things that still linger, the points of debate and the points of issues that they may have had or that may have arisen throughout their experience. So the modules, to reiterate a bit more, the modules aren't just about focusing in on certain themes and providing the wisdom of journalists. They're also about providing the experience of journalists, because they're able to highlight the questions that still linger around these issues. And ultimately, the big benefit of where all this comes together is that it is truly a plug and play and sort of modular curriculum that we were aiming for and that we made. And that's a massive benefit for when you are dealing with, say, ethics modules in pre-existing courses, if you don't teach an entire mass comm ethics course yourself, or if you're looking for material to work with within a module of your own mass comm ethics course. Because it's plug and play and developed around themes, if you want to, say, talk about with your students an issue of whether or not it's okay to intervene in a story given certain circumstances, or how to go about best protecting sources, you're able to dive into one of these modules and see a wealth of articles that have been vetted and approved by the Shadid nomination process. They are finalists and winners. And you're able to leverage the purified form of that knowledge and experience that the journalists had, because that was the ultimate goal here. It does go into different modules covering broad themes, but those themes are bolstered and improved by the individual experiences of each journalist dealing with the stories that they dealt with. So ultimately, it's less of a broad, overarching, singular curriculum, even though it is under one umbrella and under one theme and utilizing Shadid resources. It's more of a modular, plug and play, learn from experiences of journalists, utilize the wealth of knowledge that they have, and in a more efficient and formatable way for your course by being modular and plug and play.
Thank you so much, Luke. And you know, while we're officially launching the curriculum today, some crafty folks have already found their way to it. And we envisioned educators and students as our primary audience, but I was very grateful to receive a text from a friend who is a journalist who said, this is a gold mine for us when we're trying to resolve issues that we're facing in the newsroom. We can dig into this. You know, we have questions about privacy. We can go and look at these finalists and how they tackled the questions that we face. So it was sort of an unintended audience. You know, we were really thinking about the education context, but it has life far beyond, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also completely forgot to mention that as the Shadid Award continues to grow and develop, the actual curriculum itself will be bolstered with the new additions and the newcomers. So in the professional sense, especially as new problems arise, because of course we saw a whole new slew of issues and benefits from COVID in terms of the journalistic logistical process. As the professional world develops, we aim to integrate these new problems and these new issues into the curriculum as it grows along by integrating new work and highlighting these new issues and providing better perspective. So it's definitely going to be a continuing and evolving process.
Thank you, Luke. Martha, I'd like to turn to you. You're featured in the Shadid curriculum, and I know you have some thoughts to share with us about your experience as a finalist and winner. And so let's turn it over to you, and I think you're going to project some slides for us.
Yes. Hi, Katie. Hi, Luke. What I'm going to do is walk you through a very shortened version of an investigative project we did, and then talk about a couple of the key ethical problems we had in doing that reporting, and then open it up to questions. So let me share my slideshow with you. And oh. Let me try this one more time.
We are all so used to these 14 months of these glitches, right?
Yeah. I'm wondering what you see. Do you see a map or do you see me?
We don't see a screen.
Okay. I think we're very close now. Do you see now a map?
And there we see it. It is now there.
Wonderful. Great.
Perfect.
Okay. Our project on seafood from slaves began with individuals reporting in Thailand that they had been enslaved on a boat and had run away from the boat. And there was anecdotal stories from AP and from others. And we decided they weren't having any impact. And so we decided we wanted to try to nail this down a little better. And we began crowdsourcing where the men said they had been enslaved. And when I say we, my colleagues Margie Mason and Robin McDowell and Esther Toussaint are the bulk of the collective we. So I don't want to make it sound like I did this project alone at all. They did the bulk of the work. So we crowdsourced where people said they had been enslaved, and it was a small island called Benjina in Indonesia. We used Google Maps to look at it, and we could see maybe there's lots of boats and maybe what would be a seafood processing plant. And so we went there, and when Robin got there, she speaks Bahasa, and found men on boats who did not speak Bahasa, the language of Indonesia. They spoke Burmese. And so she observed the men working but couldn't communicate with them. And she asked our colleague Esther to come from Burma right away, which was no easy trip. It was airplane to boat to private boat. And while Esther took 4 days to come, Robin carefully observed the seafood, the species, what was happening to it, and where it was being loaded into one large commercial refrigerated boat. When Esther got there, the story busted open because the men were very happy to have a Burmese-speaking American journalist. And they told their story of how they had thought they were signing up for jobs in Thailand, but when they got there, were given fake Thai IDs and then sent onto boats. She asked to see more of them, talk to more of them, and one man took her out to a graveyard where Burmese men were being buried. If they died at sea, they would be put in the hatch of the fishing boat with the fish, brought back and buried under Thai names. So even if they had died, they were still had their names taken from them. Inside that large processing plant, she saw men who were in cages, and Esther was told immediately to leave and threatened. And so with Robin, they taught somebody down on the docks, a worker, how to use the GoPro. And he went back in and filmed the men who said that they were being held in these cages while their boats were on shore, because there was a fear that they, like many others, would run into the forests if they were allowed to get off their boats. And so they were locked in the cages. Once we saw these images, we had a tremendous sense of urgency because, well, people were being locked up in this way, and we wanted to report it, but we knew that if we could tie their seafood to Western markets, it would have a much bigger impact. And so immediately began tracking that boat, the Silver Sea Line, where all the seafood from the smaller boats had been loaded. And fortunately, that boat left Indonesia and headed toward Thailand. And we were able to track it using something called marine traffic, which is a very useful ship tracking software. When the boat came in close to Thailand, we set up a stakeout, 2 pickup trucks with shells on the back. And if anyone of you have ever been in Thailand, I will tell you that there was a series of mistakes made at this point that included not having air conditioning and not having enough food and drink. But there it was, the boat, the Silver Sea Line, came into port, and they began unloading it into these trucks. And when the trucks pulled out, we pulled out as well and followed them down the highways of Samut Sakhon in Thailand and watched as they pulled into factories. And this is definitely shortcutting the amount of reporting it took, but we used customs bills of lading. If you've ever gone to a post office and mailed a package overseas, you have to fill out a little form that says what it is you're sending. And these are now being digitized in almost real time. So we could see where something had gone from that Thai factory to the United States. At least we could see that it went to a seafood distributor in the United States. And if you think about buying seafood in a supermarket, a lot of times it just comes under a plastic label, like a clear saran wrap with a stamped on label. So we went to the Boston Seafood Expo and talked to the distributors that we had tracked this seafood to, as well as trying to find out what labels they sell under, what markets they sell in, et cetera. This was ended up being a fairly hostile environment for me because I told the organizers right off the bat what I was doing, possibly a mistake. They put out a blog post with my photo and told everybody that I was a reporter working on stories about labor abuse in seafood supply chains. And it was not such a friendly reception. However, we got the information we needed, including from Thai officials who were there, and eventually were able to track seafood in the supply network from that island on Benjina, where the men were enslaved, to these distributors, markets, and products in the US, including Walmart. Then we went to our company attorneys and said, so we have this story about how Walmart is selling seafood from slaves. And they said we needed to explain better. So we made them a sticky chart poster of it with the refrigerator ship and the jail and the port and where it went to the market. And then we began wrestling with how to write it. And I include this because it is the use of language becomes a very ethical dilemma. So slavery taints global supply of seafood. That word taint could be seen as that the seafood itself is going to make you sick. The Burmese slaves sat on the floor. You could see in the photo they were standing and stared through the rusty bars of their locked cage. Do we need the word locked? If they're in the cage, why wouldn't they leave? Hidden on a tiny tropical island thousands of miles from home. I know that most American readers, when they see Benjina, Indonesia, and Burmese, don't understand how far apart those two countries are. Just a few yards away, other workers, now we're writing about people who are enslaved, and so you need to be careful of those workers being paid, loaded cargo ships with slave-caught seafood, and a copy editor out here is going to insist we get that hyphen in slave-caught. And then here's some really tricky language that crowds, I think eventually we settled on clouds, the supply networks of major supermarkets, restaurants, and even pet stores in the United States. And the story needed to have a caveat. You cannot track a single fish. So it was really the supply networks, and that's not beautiful language for journalists. Once the story hit, the response was immediate. Indonesian authorities reached Benjina in 1 week and began interviewing the men. Of course, all of the American companies expressed great regret and said they were going to do better. And in interviewing these men, Robin, who was on the island, said, they're going to be beaten and killed for speaking to you as investigators. And they said, no, anyone who wants to come can come with us. And so then they went with a bullhorn into the streets of this little island and said, anyone who wants to leave, who has been held, can come. And they announced this in Laotian, Cambodian, Vietnamese, Burmese, Thai, and men began emerging from abandoned buildings, from the forest, and they began to realize that their ordeal, which had gone on for years, some as 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, they had not heard or been in touch with their families. They had not been paid. They had been forced to work, and they began to realize this ordeal was coming to an end, perhaps. They got them all on the dock and said, how many of you want to get on the boats and come with us? And we kept rewriting this story, which was very complicated because it was via text from Robin, and then we would fill it in. But it was, a dozen men are being freed, 50 men are being freed. On this day on Benjina, 150 men are being freed, 400 men are being freed. It was just updating and updating. And they put them on the boats where they had been enslaved. They commandeered those boats. They commandeered the oil and gas from them and took them to rescue them to a hurricane evacuation center on another island, where the arduous task of identifying everybody began, because they had had all of their identities stripped. And in the end, it was, as you said, it was more than 2,000. And so we documented how they identified them, and we wanted our readers to understand and connect with these people. And so we used different ways of interactive media to have people see that these were human beings. These could be your sons, your brothers, your uncles. These were young men and older men. And we tried to tell their stories in very human ways, including as they began to reunite with their families. And so eventually, the International Organization for Migration began to be able to send them home. And this man, Mint Nang, we told his story. 22 years he had been gone. His sister here hugging him hadn't seen or heard from him, but they had not given up, nor had his mother. And when they reunited, one of our problems was staying out of the way, actually, keeping the cameras and video out of the way and not being engaged with them. The family rinsed him off, and thus we began talking to men who had been enslaved once they returned. And what they told us was that a number of boats had left the island during the period between our publication and when the rescuers arrived. And we, using business records, were able to identify where they may have gotten permits off Papua New Guinea. We considered how to get there. They were at sea, and we eventually began calling. I just called the Pentagon and anyone else who might have a satellite camera in space. Finally, a private company, Digital Globe, I reached the CEO and began talking very quickly about how I thought there might be some boats in this 500 square mile area where we thought men might be enslaved. And would he please snap us a photo? And he said, this is a moving needle in a haystack, but we'll snap the photo. And the next day, the photo came back, and I was very disappointed. And they said, get on a plane and come to Boulder. We have something to show you. So within the photo were some of those boats that looked like they were from Benjina, loading onto the Silver Sea 2, a sister ship of that first one. And ethical question arose, do we go to law enforcement or do we do the story? We sent the photos to men who had been rescued and had them confirm that these were their boats because they had lived on them for so many years. They could look at the details and know they were them. And then we split up. Some of us contacted law enforcement and some of us reported the story. So this is the Indonesian fishing minister. We knew there were enslaved men at this moment on these boats. Unloading takes about 10 hours. So we were reporting and also letting them know. And they seized those boats and rescued more men. And I will stop that story here, which is how we legally could or couldn't participate in their cases against their owners and the boat owners. So okay, couple of ethical issues that came up for us during that reporting. When it came time for us to publish, we told our editors, we can't publish the images of the men in cages on the island or they will be killed. Their evidence, they spoke to us. And so we gave our editors 3 options. We said we can blur their faces, which goes against AP ethics on not altering images. We could use silhouette and hand photos and crop out heads, which we have done in the past, and we had captured those images, or we could get them rescued and off the island before we publish, which would mean longer periods of time for men on the island, which could risk their lives. And also, we don't know how to rescue people. But the editors liked that third option and got off the phone. And the 3 of us, Margie, Robin, and I, said, okay, we don't know anything about rescuing people. But Margie had a really good connection with the International Organization for Migration. And she explained to them that what we had found, but why it was so important to not initiate a massive organization until they got those first men whose images we had off the island, allow us to publish and then respond. And because she had a many-year relationship with them, they understood and they agreed. And they went to the island and they rescued, I think, 8 men before we even published. The men were reluctant to leave. They didn't know why they were being taken. And it took a lot of explaining from Esther to them what was happening. But in the end, being able to use those images had a profound impact, made the story have a much more profound impact I mentioned the use of language was also just in our writing was a real lot of ethical grappling with our style or our standards editors. The issue of whether to intervene when we found the men enslaved on boats that were not going to be staying there, that were going to be moving. We just split up so that some reporters reported and then some reporters contacted authorities. And this issue of participating in court, I will say that as we continued doing stories like this, we got better at publishing legal details on kind of interactive websites that prosecutors and researchers could use so that they could see who the middlemen were and where the bills of lading had led us, to give more rich details. So we're not doing these investigations for the legal side of the world. We're doing these to engage and inform our readers. But we did know that those rich details were what were going to make it possible for prosecutors and lawyers to take action. So that's my 15 minutes. I think, Katie, that it's time for Q&A. Is that correct?
Well, I'm actually going to now share my screen and walk through a little bit, and so that people can see the tremendous work that Luke has done, and maybe envision how the curriculum will fit in their own teaching or in their own newsroom. So I'm going to try to do the screen sharing thing. Make sure I get this right.
I should mention, I plan to use your curriculum about our story in my teaching. Just a little meta, but it's better than what I can do. So yeah.
I love that approach. That's exactly what it's intended to do. So Krista, I think you can bring forward the screen share that I did. Perfect. Excellent. So this picture here is a picture of Anthony. He is in one of the classrooms here in Vilas Hall in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. He's engaging with students, which he did every single time he visited us. His first question was, when do I get to be with students? He remembered vividly what it was like to be here in the journalism school and also in the newsroom of the Daily Cardinal, one of our 2 student newspapers here. And this just sums up Anthony. He was so vivid and avid and engaged, and Martha, you knew him, and so you know how this describes him. And this is my favorite quote from anything that Anthony ever did with us, is the best journalism is sometimes about footnotes, when we write small to say something big. And I think that really characterizes so much of his reporting in Iraq and also beyond there. So we set up, as Luke mentioned, 6 areas of focus. So the modules are approaching stories without prejudice. So how you can work with diverse sources, as I think tying back to Byron with his keynote this morning, the idea of seeing sources as people, not as a means to a story end. Then balancing intrusion and respect. So 2 finalists here who really throughout the reporting process thought carefully about the intrusive nature of reporting and the struggle the ethical struggles that can bring. We have a module on deceit, when we are being upfront and when we are not being upfront, and how sometimes that's necessary to get a story reported. We have a module I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in a minute on intervening in a story. And here you see the AP Seafood from Slaves package right here on intervention. And we have a note in the chat from Steve Fox that he already has used that module in class, and it yielded a fantastic discussion. Then we talk about journalism as a public service. And, I'll just hit one here from the Boston Globe, the Father, My Father, really followed unlikely paths to get to the story and showed the tremendous public service that can come from being curious within your reporting. And then finally, protecting sources. It's such an important question for all of us. Martha, you mentioned that came up within your reporting as well. So let me dig in and show one package in a little bit more detail, and that's also in our intervening segment. and Venezuela Undone, which is journalist Hannah Dreier, who at the time was with the Associated Press and has since gone on. So she was talking about, sort of, she was in Venezuela and the sort of social, how things were unraveling socially within Venezuela. And part of that included reporting on food shortages and health problems and intense poverty. It was an economy that was unraveling, and she was there to tell the story firsthand. But that meant that she was seeing the suffering firsthand and not knowing when to intervene or not intervene, or thinking about it constantly, questioning constantly what that meant. One of the tenets of journalism is that we should be independent. What does that mean when you see someone who is suffering, when you have food and they are starving? What does it, do you remain independent of them? Is that actually the ethical choice? So within each module here, so I'll just show you Hannah's module. What Luke has done is summarized the issues in the case. What were the kinds of things that reporters were facing? What were the questions that they were raising within their own minds? How did they resolve those? Each one includes an article, the articles. Sometimes these are series, sometimes it's just one piece. And then they also include the nomination. And we ask, in the nomination, we ask the nominees to describe the questions that arose and how they resolve them. And so these are phenomenal readings for everyone to say, okay, what questions came up? And then how did we go through that all important ethical reasoning to come to a conclusion that we could justify? I often am known to say, when people call the ethics center or send me an email, they often think that I have some like master rubber stamp that I can go ka-chunk, that's ethical, ka-chunk, that's unethical. And that's just not the way ethics works. Ethics is really about that reasoning process. So how we can come to justify the decisions we make to the people who would be affected by those decisions. And so each of these nominations, like this one here for Hannah, they help us see that reasoning up front. We get into the minds and the logic and the questions and the answers in each case. And so I think it provides this real richness to conversations about ethics. And then, as Luke mentioned, each of these modules includes video interviews from the nominee. And I'm not going to play, in the interest of time, I'm not going to play Hannah's here, but in it, she just has this phenomenal quote that journalism can act as a sort of empathy creator. And I think that these are going to they're really going to personalize these reporters to students and fellow reporters, so that you kind of see behind the byline and you understand the deep questions that people ask. It's a time, oh, I'm sorry, and then finally, the last part of the module are questions that Luke has served up that can start as a foundation for these discussions. It is a time when, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. It is a time when, sorry, apologize. There you go. It is a time when journalism is facing questions of trust, facing a lot of criticism, some of it justified. I will never make excuses for when journalism goes wrong, but a lot of it unjustified and really motivated by a desire to pollute the information environment, to undercut journalism as the public service that it actually is. I think that by going through things like the modules in the Shadid curriculum and showing the decision-making process, we can counteract some of that cynicism and some of that questioning. I think every single year when these nominations come in, I am absolutely blown away by the quality of the reporting and the integrity that people show. These are not easy decisions. It's not. I mean, Martha was up at night wondering about the safety of slaves who had spoken with her and her team. So, these are important decisions, and they're not made lightly. And I hope that the Center for Journalism Ethics can be a part of helping people see that, to look beyond the byline at the real moral character that people are bringing to these decisions. So, I congratulate you, Martha, all of our finalists and winners in the Shadid curriculum, and I thank you, Luke, for developing this. If anybody has any questions about the curriculum, please feel free to throw it into the chat, and we'd be happy to address it. But I just remain incredibly grateful for people who have shared their stories with us, who have shined a light on the very difficult choices that they have to make. It's not easy to open up and say that I have questions about my own work. So I'm really, really grateful to everyone for this. And by the way, I should note that some of our finalists have said they are willing to come in and do a Zoom visit in a class, or if Martha's one of them, so they can come into your classroom either virtually, or if you're down the street in California, maybe even in person at some point post-pandemic. So that really shows again that people want to help the next generation, the up and coming journalists. People want them to see that you can bring integrity to your work. You can operate ethically, even when situations are incredibly difficult. So again, thank you, Martha, for your work as a journalist and for your willingness to let us advance that work and share it with others. And thank you, Luke, for the tremendous commitment and just intellectual mettle you brought to building this. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie, and for all the great work you guys do. And I will mention that I did have a blessed opportunity to work with Anthony during very, very chaotic riots in Los Angeles. And his number one priority was all of our safety, always, and our well-being, not just our physical safety, but our emotional well-being during a chaotic time.
Yeah.
So he's very kind. Yeah.
We miss him. Oh, we sure
Yeah.
do. Okay, with that, I'm going to bring us to a close and again, thank our sponsors for this virtual conference. So Craig Newmark Philanthropies, MG&E, American Family Insurance, the Wisconsin Broadcasters Association, the Wisconsin Newspaper Association, and Wisconsin Watch, the nonprofit investigative journalism outfit that operates just down the hall from me. I'd also again like to thank our advisory board. You all have been just so wonderful and so committed to the work of the center, and we would be nowhere without you. I would also be nowhere, I'd be less than nowhere without Krista Eastman, the phenomenal administrator for the center, who is tireless and funny and kind and just an amazing, amazing person to work with. We also have this band of wonderful students who have done great work this year, even though we've all been remote. Ellie Spadaccini is sitting in the green room of this broadcast. She's the one who's been helping move all of these parts to be with you today. Luke, again, I don't know where we'd be without his work on the Shadid curriculum. And then our student fellows and student workers, Bashir Aiden, Elise Goldstein, and Abigail Steinberg. Thank you, you guys. If you have been following us on Twitter as well, you'll see a lot of work coming out of them over there. As we close, I would love to ask you to stay with us, stay connected with the center through the Shadid curriculum, through the reporting that our fellows publish on our website. We have other resources beyond the curriculum. If you go to our site under the resources tab, for instance, you'll find a guide to less extractive reporting that was done by one of our past fellows and has been really helpful in thinking about how we make connections with sources, as we heard about in our innovations panel, without just extracting information from them and just leaving them behind with little regard for what's left. And then finally, our Anthony Shadid Award for Journalism Ethics will be a virtual presentation that's going to be on May 10th, and we have phenomenal guests. So journalist David Marinus is going to be interviewing Lindsay Addario, who is one of the world's best photojournalists. She does absolutely outstanding work and actually once was held captive with Anthony Shadid while they were reporting in the Middle East. So please stay with us for that. You are more than welcome to join our mailing list and get updates from the center. Again, thank you to everyone for being with us. Here's the link, by the way, to the Shadid Award registration. So you can sign up already and join us on May 10th. So again, thank you everybody from the Center for Journalism Ethics, and I hope to see you in person and or virtually next year. Bye-bye.